April 27, 1942. Pearl Harbor. The air in the sink-pack plot room tasted faintly of rubber and pencil shavings, a smell that clung to maps like the ghost of certainty. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood a pace back from the central chart, the Pacific hammered flat beneath a web of grease pencil arcs. He carried stillness the way other men wore rank, quiet, unhurried, eyes that missed nothing. Behind him, the grey book was being updated, its daily estimates threaded with radio intercepts from the basement men in Station HYPO. On Nimitz's wall, the Coral Sea was a geometry problem measured in deck cycles and fuel states. The enemy's plan had a name, Operation MO, a thrust to Port Moresby by sea and an airborne feint toward Tulagi. The intent was beautifully simple and strategically lethal. Cut Australia's artery, isolate it from the United States, and springboard to the New Hebrides. The decrypts were not perfect, they never were. Call signs blurred, dates fuzzed, weather smudged the edges. But the pattern was unmistakable, carriers to cover invasion convoys pushing down past the Solomons into that blue quadrilateral east of New Guinea. From the first, Nimitz treated intelligence as maneuver space. It was not prophecy, it was time. That was the coin he lacked most. What he did have were two carriers he could risk, Yorktown, CV-5, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and Lexington, CV-2, under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, the latter freshly detached from Rear Admiral Jack Brown's Task Force 11. The old battle line lay in the mud of December. The new fleet was a handful of flight decks and an oil train stretched to the horizon. On the plot, wax pencils arced out PBY search fans from Noumea and Townsville. B-17S in MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area would sweep high and long. But the weight of decision lay at Pearl. To cover a gap that wide with just two flat tops required audacity wrapped in restraint, a willingness to fight, and a discipline not to chase ghosts. Outside, the yard sirens still rose and fell at shift changes. Inside, Nimitz's voice was low when he gave the order that set the geometry. Fletcher to command a combined carrier task force in the Coral Sea. Maintain radio silence, strike if you can, deny if you must, live to fight again. The verbs mattered. This was not Jutland, and it would never be. The Battle of the Coral Sea would be the first in history where the capital ships never saw each other. Nimitz understood before many did that, in the new war, sight lines had been replaced by search arcs, and the main battery would launch into a sky of uncertainty. The pencil moved again. A thin line traced south from the Solomons. Tulagi. If the Japanese touched there first, it would be bait and proof. Bait to draw American carriers north, proof that HYPO's ghosts wore uniforms and carried flight plans. Around the table, his operations staff murmured ranges and timings. Yorktown's air group, VB-5 and VS-5 with SBDs, VT-5's Devastators, and VF-42's Wildcats, could reach Tulagi from the southeast if the ship sprinted into launch position. Lexington would follow. Together they could threaten the backbone of Shokaku Zuikaku if luck and scouting favoured them. If not, they would strike at what the enemy offered and conserve their weight. The Admiral nodded once. The board was set. He had learned patience in steel rooms at test depth. Submariners measure courage by what you do not do. No wasted motion, no raised voice, no panic when the hull sings. That was the cadence Nimitz brought upstairs. Fuel was a weapon. Fatigue was a weapon. Silence was a weapon. When staff fretted about MacArthur's repeated signals, Port Moresby must not fall, Nimitz did not argue strategy on paper. He widened the search plan and shortened the leash on pursuit. The sea would offer targets soon enough. The trick was to keep American decks intact long enough to accept them. The intelligence summaries piled up like tide marks. Convoy traces out of Rabaul. Air cover promised from the MO striking force. A light carrier rumoured among the heavyweights. HYPO's men, shivering in the over-air-conditioned basement, sent up their best triangulations with a humility Nimitz appreciated. Nothing was certain, everything fit. He told his staff what he always told them at moments like this. We will act on the best picture we have at the hour we must act. If there was faith in that, it was not mystical. It was faith in sailors who could turn uncertain pictures into certain violence. He walked the map with 2 fingers, pointer and middle, like a man pacing out a lawn he intended to mow. Fletcher's force was here, Fitch's there, the oilers strung back like beads in the wake. The distances were a discipline. An SBD could search 200 miles and return with fuel to spare if you launched at dawn and recovered on schedule. Stretch the arc and you paid in gas you might need later under attack. Launch too few and you fought blind. Launch too many and you fought empty. Nimitz let the room argue the geometry and then fixed the angles himself, quietly, almost shyly, as though the pencil were deciding and he was only its hand. On the wall, the South Pacific looked simple. On the water, simple turned cruel. Weather in the Coral Sea did not just conceal, it lied, stacking cloud shelves that ate radioman bearings and produced mirages of fleets that weren't there. He layered the reconnaissance to fight the lies. PBYs low and wide, army heavies high and fast, carrier scouts in the gaps. No single report would carry the day. A pattern would. Station HYPO would stitch the radio skeleton. The aviators would hang flesh on it. The practicalities were as prosaic as they were decisive. Aviation gasoline was measured not merely by ton, but by deck cycle. How many launches could a ship afford before her lines ran dry? How many torpedoes could be struck below and brought up again without slowing the whole ship's pulse? Could Lexington's tired devastators be nursed another month into relevance? Nimitz accepted every imperfection and arranged around it. You fight with the fleet you have, and try to return with enough of it to fight again. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed over the charts and the day's intercepts were chalked into the log, the Admiral's office door stayed cracked. Officers wandered in with questions and left with tasks. He read everything, after action from the Marshal's raiders, a sour report on torpedo performance, an Australian cable fretting about Townsville's vulnerability, and then set them aside in a neat stack only he understood. From the stack came the next day's instructions, small course changes with large meanings, search sectors widened, radio silence reiterated, a message to MacArthur promising vigorous action in the Coral Sea without promising away the fleet. He remembered faces when he moved the pins. Fletcher, cautious, methodical. Fitch, steady where others were brilliant. The aviators with their squadron codes and poker game grins. Nimitz did not indulge in oratory. He gave them clarity instead. "This is the point," he said to an aide, tapping the Coral Sea with the pencil's eraser. "If we hold this, we hold the road to Australia. If we cannot hold it, we will have to take it back, at twice the cost." Night pressed its cool cheek against the windows. Somewhere south and east of New Guinea, 2 American task forces ploughed black water, stack gas smearing the stars. On Yorktown's bridge, a quartermaster fought sleep with bad coffee. In Lexington's ready room, a section leader traced a triangle of headings on a kneeboard and tried not to think about the way torpedoes behaved when dropped too fast. On the North Road in Tokyo, planners counted on Port Moresby by sea. In Honolulu, a Texan with patient eyes marked arcs and waited to see if pencils could bend fate. Before he left the plot room, Nimitz stepped close to the chart and adjusted one last line, barely an inch but a dozen miles at sea. It brought Fletcher and Fitch a heartbeat nearer without erasing the space each needed to breathe. "That will do," he said, almost to himself. He set the pencil down parallel to the map's neat bottom edge, a small, private ritual of order against a continent of uncertainty, and walked back into the night. The Coral Sea was no longer a sketch on the wall, but a chessboard in motion. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood in his map room with the latest decrypts in hand. the faint scent of mimeographed paper clinging to his uniform. Station HYPO's linguists had cracked enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to expose the bones of Operation MO. The Japanese meant to seize Tulagi and then Port Moresby, with Carrier Division 5, Shokaku and Zuikaku, covering the invasion convoys. A light carrier, Shoho, would provide additional air cover, while land-based aircraft from Rabaul and Leh would tighten the net. It was the kind of plan the Japanese Navy had executed flawlessly since December, coordinated thrusts with overlapping air and sea power, timed like a clock. But now, for the first time, Nimitz could read the clock face before the hands struck. The intercepts were not perfect. HYPO could not always untangle dates from call signs or ship names from cover designations. But they knew enough. The invasion convoy would sortie from Rabaul, covered by carriers. Their intent was unmistakable. Port Moresby was the key to Australia. Nimitz's staff argued timing. If the Americans moved too soon, they might miss the main body and spend precious fuel chasing shadows. Too late, and Port Moresby would fall. The Admiral's answer was characteristically spare. "We will meet them on the water. We will not wait for them on the beach." 2 carriers, Yorktown, CV-5, and Lexington, CV-2, were all he could risk. Yorktown, blooded in the Marshalls and Leh Salamaua raids, was fast, her air group aggressive. Lexington, older and slower to refuel, carried a veteran crew that had kept her afloat through the lean months after Pearl. Together they were fragile power projected across thousands of miles of empty ocean. Nimitz wired Fletcher his instructions in prose, as lean as his Texas drawl. Maintain radio silence. Strike if the opportunity presents. Conserve strength if it does not. Avoid piecemeal engagement. Fight as a team. Objective: deny the enemy Port Moresby. Fletcher was placed in overall command, Fitch under him. Some in Pearl muttered that Fletcher was too cautious, too slow to seize fleeting chances. Nimitz thought otherwise. Coral Sea was not about glory. It was about holding the line. Fletcher's restraint might be the very shield the carriers needed. On May 3rd, Japanese troops seized Tulagi, a speck of an island but an important seaplane base at the edge of the Solomons. To Nimitz, it was confirmation. HYPO had read the pattern right. Fletcher, already moving north, struck immediately. At dawn on May 4th, Yorktown's SBDS and Devastators pounced on Japanese shipping off Tulagi, sinking a destroyer and several auxiliaries. The raid did little to slow Operation MO, but it proved the carriers were in the fight, and that HYPO's ghosts wore steel. Back at Pearl, Nimitz marked the strike with a single nod. The Japanese would now know American carriers were in the theatre. That was risk, but also bait. By May 5th, the converging fleets were feeling for each other in the mist and storms of the Coral Sea. Fletcher fueled south of Guadalcanal, the vital oilers looming as large in Nimitz's mind as the carriers themselves. Without gas, the battle could not even begin. Lexington, nearly twice Yorktown's displacement, drank fuel like a battleship. Every refueling rendezvous was a vulnerability, a slow circle of ships with hoses out, praying no scout plane found them. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto's staff remained confident. The American fleet had been bloodied at Pearl and could not possibly concentrate so soon. Shokaku and Zuikaku were considered untouchable. Their pilots were hardened, their decks efficient. Yet even as they spoke, Nimitz's penciled arcs were converging on the same sea. Coral Sea would be the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. Ships would never sight each other. The struggle would be decided by scouts, fuel states, and the nerve of air group commanders. Nimitz understood the revolution better than most. At Pearl, he reminded his staff of the stakes. The main batteries are in the sky now. Whoever sees first, shoots first. The staff murmured ranges and search sectors. Yorktown's SBDS could fly out 200 miles on patrol, Lexington's devastators less. Every mile risked fuel exhaustion, but every mile of blindness risked surprise. Nimitz weighed each like a jeweler with coins, adjusting arcs and timing with his pencil's edge. In the stillness of the map room, the Admiral betrayed little, but those who served close remembered his private rituals, the way he lined pencils parallel on the chart table or paused to polish his glasses before issuing a final order. They were acts of discipline in a war built on uncertainty. His confidence was not born of certainty, but of preparation. The oilers had been staged. The army bombers were sweeping the eastern edges. The Australians at Port Moresby knew to expect air raids. Fletcher and Fitch carried orders that balanced aggression with survival. For now, that was all he could give them. As May 6th dawned, the seas around the Louisiades churned with converging fleets. The Japanese convoy pressed south under destroyer guard. Shoho cruised nearby, her decks crowded with Zeros and Vals. Farther north, Shokaku and Zuikaku prowled, their air groups poised to strike. Fletcher and Fitch, blind but searching, readied their strikes in turn. On both sides, young men in ready rooms studied target photos, fiddled with lucky charms, or scribbled last letters home. At Pearl, Nimitz bent over his map in silence. The geometry was complete. Now only the flyers could solve it. At Pearl, Nimitz tightened the lattice. From his map table, the Coral Sea looked less like an ocean and more like a loom. Threads of search patterns woven east to west, north to south. PBY Catalinas crept out on long, slow patrols, engines droning at a pace that tested nerves and patience. They flew into weather that would have grounded more fragile aircraft, searching for convoys that blended into the haze of horizon and cloud. From Australia, B-17s clawed skyward, their altitude buying them range, their speed a tenuous insurance against interception. On the carriers themselves, there was no room for single-purpose aircraft. SBD Dauntlesses pulled double duty, scouts in the morning, dive bombers when the target was found. Launch cycles became wagers, fuel consumed for information, aircraft risked for a shadow of a sighting. From Honolulu, Nimitz's scribbles across the Coral Sea resembled a child's impatient scrawl. In truth, it was a net, each knot placed with intent. He reminded his subordinates of a hard truth. You will not always have certainty. You must act anyway. It was the creed of a submariner, carried now into the largest ocean war in history. Dawn broke on May 7th with possibility sharp in the air. Radio fragments and reconnaissance hints painted a picture that shifted by the hour. Enemy carriers east of New Guinea, then south, then gone altogether. Both sides, groping in the same fog, loosed their air groups into the void. For the Americans, the strike packages clawed south and west, squadrons ranging far across the featureless water. Pilots strained eyes against glare and cloud, their reports trickling back in contradictions. Nothing here, a glimmer there, possible masts on the horizon. The Japanese, acting on their own fragmentary intelligence, launched heavy strikes northward. But instead of American carriers, they found USS Neosho AO-23, a fleet oiler, and her escort, the destroyer USS Sims DD-409. To Japanese eyes, they looked like prey too valuable to pass. The strike force fell upon them with the fury meant for flattops. Sims was broken apart by bombs, rolling into the sea with her crew. Neosho, blasted and burning, fought to stay afloat as her sailors battled fire and fuel slicks. It was a bloody miscue, but not a decisive one. The Japanese had gutted arteries, not the heart. Fletcher's task force still steamed intact, its decks ready for the blow Nimitz had trained them to deliver. Hours later in Pearl, summaries reached the Sinkpack war room. Reports scrawled in faint carbon paper told the tale. Neosho crippled, Sims lost, but the carriers unscathed. Nimitz studied the lines without drama. There was no anger in him for the fog of war. He had lived too long with incomplete bearings, with sonar echoes that might be whales or might be destroyers. Instead, he adjusted. "Search wider," he ordered. "Conserve your main body." The killing blow is still out there. His pencil moved a fraction of an inch across the coral sea, widening arcs, tightening the geometry. The hunt was still on. Every admiral learns where his own temperament can end the war all by itself. For some it is impatience, for others timidity. Nimitz's gift was the patience to let a well-set plan breathe. He knew that to spring too soon was to reveal strength before it could land a decisive strike. Submariners call it holding the shot, waiting until the target fills the scope, even as depth charges tick above. Now, with two carriers at the mercy of intelligence that blurred as often as it clarified, patience was his weapon. That afternoon, the ocean finally yielded its secret. At 10:40, a Yorktown scout, Ensign Joseph Smith of Scouting Squadron 5, sighted a Japanese light carrier with cruisers and destroyers in company. His voice crackled back across the ether. "Light carrier sighted, Shoho." The words were clear, mercifully free of ambiguity. No ghosts, no false mastheads. This was steel. Within minutes, Fletcher ordered a full strike. From Yorktown and Lexington, Dauntlesses, Devastators, and Wildcats thundered off the decks, their engines clawing skyward. Pilots leaned into harnesses, the ocean falling away beneath them as they climbed toward destiny. The hunters had found flesh. At Pearl, the message arrived hours later, scribbled into the grey book. Nimitz read it in silence, glasses low on his nose. A light carrier, not the fleet carriers he most feared, but still a blow worth striking. He made no gesture, offered no flourish. The staff would later recall only his quiet nod before turning back to the plot. The Admiral knew that this was not the end, only the beginning. Shoho was a stepping stone. The giants, Shokaku and Zuikaku, still lurked in the storm bands of the Coral Sea, their decks heavy with zeros and vowels. But he also knew what a first kill meant. For Fletcher, for Fitch, for the air groups who had lived through weeks of fruitless scouting, it was proof that the enemy could be found, that HYPO's whispers could be made into targets of flesh and steel. On the carrier decks, ordnance men heaved bombs into cradles, mechanics tightened cowling bolts with bleeding knuckles, and pilots scribbled notes about bearing and wind. Over the intercoms came the words that electrified any ready room. "We have a carrier sighted." For the aviators, the Coral Sea was no longer a blue desert. It was a hunting ground. The hunters rolled in. The Coral Sea, May 7th, 1942. Noon sun hammered the ocean flat, glare bouncing off whitecaps as though the sea itself wanted to blind the aviators coming for it. Beneath that glare steamed the light carrier Shoho, flagship of Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto's support force. She had been detached to cover invasion transports bound for Tulagi and Port Moresby, a guardian meant to shield the flanks while the heavyweights Shokaku and Zuikaku prepared the hammer blow. Shoho's air group numbered barely 24 planes, zeros and claudes for defence, vals for token strike. It was not enough. From the northeast, the Americans were coming. 93 aircraft, launched from Yorktown and Lexington, clawed the humid sky in tight formation. SBD Dauntlesses lumbered under the weight of 1,000-pound bombs, TBD Devastators skimmed low, torpedoes cradled like burdens they could barely lift. Wildcats rode shotgun, though there were few enemy fighters expected. It was a strike born of opportunity, quick, heavy, overwhelming. At 11 o'clock, Lexington's scout planes confirmed the target. Enemy carrier sighted with cruisers. The formation shifted, bombers forming their attack boxes as the ocean below began to bristle with black flak. On Shoho's deck, frantic launches attempted to put zeros into the air. Deck crews shoved aircraft forward, elevators rattled, arrestor cables groaned. But time was gone. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon of Lexington's Scouting Squadron 2, VS-2, led the dive bombers in. At 11:25, with the carrier framed in his sight reticle, he nosed over. Dauntless dive brakes screamed, the cockpit shook with the wind howl of a vertical dive. Anti-aircraft bursts laced the sky with black puffs, close enough to rattle plexiglass. Dixon pickled his bomb at 1,500 feet and hauled back. Behind him, SBDS followed in hammerfall rhythm, each pilot releasing at intervals designed to saturate the target. At 11:30, the first 1,000-pounder struck. Shoho staggered as steel deck plates erupted in a blossom of flame. Another bomb carved through her forward hangar, igniting parked aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped upward as fuel lines and ordnance lockers surrendered to fire. Torpedo bombers from VT-2 and VT-5 pressed in from both flanks, skimming low across the froth of shell splashes. Lieutenant Commander William Birch's Devastators dropped at 900 yards. Japanese gunners stitched tracer fire across the water, but the old torpedoes ran true this time. At least two slammed into Shoho's port side. A column of water taller than her island climbed skyward, then collapsed in a brown, boiling surge. The ship rolled, fire pouring from her hangar deck vents. At 11:40, Dixon's voice carried the news across the Pacific ether. Scratch one flat top. The phrase would become immortal, a laconic marker of the first Japanese carrier sunk in the war. To the men at Pearl, to the operators straining to copy garbled Morse at Noumea, it was proof that the carriers lost at Pearl Harbor could be avenged in kind. The kill was not mercy. Strike after strike piled in. Pilots later admitted it was almost brutal, a massacre in slow motion. Bombs struck bow to stern, torpedoes cracked bulkheads, strafing runs scythed crew from the decks. Survivors flung themselves into the sea as fires spread unchecked. By 11:50, Shoho was mortally wounded, her flight deck buckled, her bow down. At 12:10, the order came to abandon ship. Sailors scrambled down lines, some leaping into oil fires that spread like ink across the surface. Destroyers tried to close for rescue, only to pull away as fresh explosions shattered the carrier's carcass. At 12:48, less than 20 minutes after the last American bomb struck, Shoho slipped beneath the waves stern first. Out of a crew of roughly 1,100, only about 200 would be rescued by Japanese destroyers. The rest vanished into the Coral Sea. The support force that was meant to guard Tulagi and Port Moresby was suddenly naked. When the after-action reports reached Hawaii, Nimitz read them with the same stillness as always. He did not exult, did not crow. Instead, he underlined Dixon's transmission in his copy of the Grey Book. The Admiral knew what many did not yet grasp, that sinking a light carrier was both tactical and symbolic. Shoho's destruction had no decisive weight in itself, but it proved two truths. American carrier doctrine worked. Coordinated dive bombing and torpedo strikes could bring down flat tops. Japanese invincibility was a myth. At the operations board, Nimitz's staff officers traced a red X across the Coral Sea plot where Shoho went down. Around it, the web of Japanese intentions now quivered uncertainly. To land at Port Moresby without air cover was suicide. To push further south meant risking the fleet carriers against Fletcher's task force. Pilots returned to Lexington and Yorktown drained, their voices cracking as they reported multiple hits. Deck crews counted holes in wings and patched fuselages with sheet metal and tape. The cost was minimal. Few planes lost, no ships damaged, but the psychological dividend was vast. Lieutenant John Powers of VB-5, who had led his section with steady precision, summed it up in his diary. "We found them. We can kill them. That's all we needed to know." On the Japanese side, officers of the invasion fleet digested the news in silence. Admiral Inoue, commanding the Port Moresby operation, understood at once. Without Shoho, his convoys would sail naked under American bombers. The calculus of risk shifted, caution replaced momentum. By sunset, the Coral Sea carried oil slicks and bodies where Shoho had been. Fletcher's task force regrouped, bracing for the inevitable counterstrike from Shokaku and Zuikaku. The battle was far from over, the real weight of Japanese naval aviation still prowled. But for the first time in the Pacific War, the United States had put a Japanese carrier under the sea. Nimitz, at Pearl, folded his arms and allowed himself a single measured thought. The balance can shift. Tomorrow would test it. May 8th, 1942. The Coral Sea lay quiet in the pale dawn, but both fleets were already searching, probing, waiting for the moment when the blind duel would resolve into combat. The Japanese had lost Shoho the day before, but their two heavyweights, Shokaku and Zuikaku, pride of Carrier Division 5, remained intact, with air groups eager to strike back. For Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding from Yorktown, and Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch on Lexington, the coming day would decide whether Port Moresby would fall, and with it the link to Australia. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz followed through dispatches that lagged hours behind reality. He knew both sides had been groping in the dark, striking at shadows, but May 8th would bring clarity. The Coral Sea was about to host history's first full-scale carrier-versus-carrier battle, and there would be no precedent to lean upon. At 6:15 a.m., search planes lifted off from both fleets almost simultaneously. SBD Dauntlesses from Yorktown and Lexington fanned out across the sea in widening arcs, while Japanese scouts from Shokaku and Zuikaku clawed for altitude on reciprocal courses. Each side's position was perilous. Two fleets within 200 miles, each poised to strike, each vulnerable to discovery. At 8:20, a Yorktown scout sighted two large carriers with 4 cruisers and destroyers northeast of the American force. The report, coded and relayed, reached Fletcher by 8:30. Almost at the same moment, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft sighted the American task force. Both sides now had coordinates. Both sides launched. Fletcher acted first. From Yorktown and Lexington, nearly 120 aircraft roared into the sky, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and escorting Wildcats. Deck crews moved with rehearsed precision, spotting planes in tight sequence, fueling lines snaking across steel, ordnance clattering into bomb cradles. By 9:15, the strike groups were on their way, climbing toward a rendezvous that would carry them north into the enemy's teeth. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi ordered his carriers to launch nearly 70 aircraft, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo planes, and Zero escorts. They arrowed south toward the Americans. For the first time in naval history, two carrier forces had unleashed full strikes at each other almost simultaneously. It was a gunfight where bullets passed in mid-air. At 11 a.m., the American strike group sighted Shokaku and Zuikaku. The sea below glittered with white wakes from escorting cruisers and destroyers. Fighters clawed upward, Zeros rising to meet the bombers. Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch led Lexington's dive bombers down through flak. Shokaku's deck crews had spotted aircraft, but many were still fueling, bombs being hoisted when the Dauntlesses came screaming out of the sun. At 11:20, the first bomb smashed into Shokaku's flight deck just forward of the island, tearing a 400-square-foot hole through planking and steel. A second exploded amidships, engulfing parked aircraft in fire. A third ploughed into the bow, wrecking elevators and starting secondary explosions. Fires roared unchecked, black smoke boiling skyward. Shokaku staggered, her flight deck torn and useless. Damage control battled furiously, but her air operations were crippled. Zuikaku, hidden by heavy squalls, escaped damage entirely. Fletcher's aviators had mauled one carrier, but they had not destroyed the division. While bombs ripped into Shokaku, Japanese bombers bore down on the American task force. Radar aboard Yorktown picked up the incoming strike just after 10:55. Wildcats scrambled to intercept, but the Zero escorts sliced into them. What followed was chaos. torpedo planes boring in low, dive bombers plunging from altitude, flak bursts filling the sky like black blossoms. At 11:20, Lexington took 2 torpedoes to port. The ship shuddered, decks tilting, compartments flooding. Minutes later, bombs rained in, 2 direct hits that tore through the hangar deck. Aviation fuel lines ruptured, fires spread. Yet the great carrier, nicknamed Lady Lex, held steady. Damage control parties swarmed through smoke-filled passages, sealing compartments, jettisoning ammunition, fighting flames. Yorktown was luckier. 1 bomb punched through her decks, killing men below, but the damage was contained. She kept flight operations going, her deck still spotted with aircraft returning from their strike. By noon, both strike groups were withdrawing. The Americans had mauled Shokaku, the Japanese had crippled Lexington. Fletcher ordered a regrouping, but within Lexington, unseen danger lurked. Gasoline vapours, released by ruptured fuel lines, pooled in compartments despite furious ventilation efforts. At 12:47, a massive internal explosion ripped through the ship. Flames leapt skyward, smoke visible for miles. Throughout the afternoon, secondary explosions rocked the carrier. Ammunition stores detonated, aircraft cooked off on the hangar deck. At 4:30 p.m., Captain Frederick Sherman, knowing the ship was lost, ordered abandon ship. Destroyers closed in, rescuing more than 2,700 crew. At 7:52 p.m., torpedoes from the destroyer Phelps delivered the final mercy. Lexington slipped beneath the Coral Sea, stern last, her flag still flying. The day ended with both sides bloodied. The Japanese had lost Shoho on May 7th, and now Shokaku was a burning wreck, too damaged to operate aircraft. Zuikaku had escaped, but her air group was decimated. The Americans had lost Lexington, while Yorktown bore scars but remained operational. Strategically, it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. Without carrier cover, transports could not risk the gauntlet of Allied air power. For the first time in the war, a major Japanese offensive had been checked. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz studied the dispatches with his customary stillness. He knew the cost, 1 carrier gone, another damaged, but also the meaning. The Japanese fleet was not invincible. Carrier doctrine had been tested in fire and proven sound. The war had turned a corner in the Coral Sea, even if the road ahead still stretched long and bloody. For the men who fought it, May 8th was seared into memory. Aviators recalled the sight of Shokaku burning, the resilience of Zuikaku, the chaos of wildcats against Zeros. Survivors of Lexington remembered the ship's decks growing hotter beneath their boots, the sickening roar of explosions, the relief of being hauled from oily seas. For Nimitz, the lesson was clear. Carriers were now the decisive arm of naval power. Battleships would never again decide a campaign. The duel in the Coral Sea had proven that the future of warfare lay on flight decks, in scouts and strike groups, in the patience to wait for sighting reports and the courage to launch into a void. The Admiral marked the day in the Grey Book not as a triumph, but as a beginning. Midway loomed only weeks away. The Coral Sea had been rehearsal. The next act would be decisive. The news reached Pearl Harbor in fragments. First came the coded reports of May 7th, Shoho sunk, Lexington damaged but afloat. Then May 8th, when the story shifted with every dispatch. Yorktown hit but operational, Lexington crippled, then gone. By the time the smoke cleared in the Coral Sea, Chester Nimitz had the shape of the battle. He called it a draw, strategically ours. The Japanese had been forced to abandon Operation MO, the drive toward Port Moresby. For the first time since December 1941, the enemy had been turned back. Yet for Nimitz, victory was not measured in headlines. It was measured in decks. And after Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy had just 2 operational fleet carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet, still returning from the Doolittle raid. Yorktown limped home, wounded, her flight deck scarred, her engineering crew weary. Against this, the Japanese still held 6 first-line carriers. The arithmetic was stark. In the Sinkpak plot room, the Coral Sea campaign was dissected with quiet precision. On one board, photographs of Shoho aflame, proof of what American dive bombers could achieve. On another, loss tallies. 69 American aircraft, 66 Japanese. More than 3,000 American sailors rescued from the sinking Lexington, roughly 1,000 Japanese casualties, most from Shoho and Shokaku's battered air group. The real prize, however, lay not in ships lost, but operations denied. Port Moresby was safe, for now. Australia's lifeline remained open. The Japanese timetable had been bent, their aura of invincibility tarnished. But Nimitz read deeper. Shokaku was crippled. Zuikaku had lost too many pilots to sortie again soon. For at least 2 months, Carrier Division 5 was out of the war. That left the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, as the main striking arm. 4 decks. Against 2 American carriers, perhaps 3 if Yorktown could be patched. It was not parity, but it was a margin he could work with. While his staff pored over damage reports, Nimitz's eyes kept returning to the other flow of paper crossing his desk, decrypts from Station HYPO. Joseph Rochefort's team in the basement had been grinding through Japanese naval codes, piecing together scraps like archaeologists. In late May, they began to see a pattern. References to an AF movements of oilers and support ships toward the Central Pacific. Talk of carriers redeploying north. AF is Midway, Rochefort insisted. His logic was plain. AF had been used before in traffic about Midway, and the Japanese were clearly preparing a major operation. The timing fit. With Port Moresby denied, Yamamoto would strike east, extending the perimeter, hoping to draw out and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers. Washington was skeptical. Admiral King pressed for certainty. The Navy Department wanted more than hunches. Nimitz, a submariner by training, knew the value of faith in men who produced results. He backed Rochefort. At his urging, a ruse was staged. Midway was ordered to broadcast an uncoded message about a breakdown in its water distillation plant. Days later, Japanese intercepts reported AF short of water. Proof. The target was Midway. Nimitz faced a decision that would shape the war. His carriers were battered. His battleships still lay in the mud of Pearl Harbor. His air groups were green compared to Japan's hardened veterans. But the opportunity was stark. Yamamoto was dividing his forces, sending the main carrier strike force against Midway while scattering support units toward the Aleutians. If the Americans could meet the Japanese carriers at Midway with surprise on their side, they could even the odds. The gamble was immense. If Fletcher and Spruance, who would soon take command of Enterprise and Hornet after Halsey's illness, lost, Hawaii itself could be threatened. If they won, the balance of naval power in the Pacific might shift. Nimitz made the call. On May 27, 1942, he issued orders. Enterprise and Hornet to sortie from Pearl, rendezvous with Yorktown once she could be readied. Midway to be reinforced with every available marine aircraft. Submarines to patrol likely approach routes. The trap was set. There remained the question of Yorktown. After Coral Sea, she had limped into Pearl with a bomb hole through her flight deck, shattered compartments, and wounded machinery. Estimates from shipyard officers suggested 3 months of repair. Nimitz gave them 3 days. The order was blunt. Get her ready for battle. Hundreds of Pearl Harbor yard workers swarmed the ship, welding steel, replacing wiring, patching the flight deck with timbers and steel plates. Aviation fuel lines were rebuilt, elevators jury-rigged, radar restored. Sailors worked alongside civilians without pause, sleeping in shifts beside their stations. On May 30th, just 72 hours after docking, Yorktown steamed out to join the fleet. She was not whole, but she could fly her air group, and that was enough. Nimitz visited the ship before she sailed, his calm presence a quiet benediction. He said little, but his words carried the weight of decision. The fate of the Pacific rests on you now. As May ended, the Pacific seemed to hold its breath. In Tokyo, Yamamoto's staff prepared for a decisive blow. In Hawaii, Nimitz studied the Grey Book and Rochefort's latest decrypts. He knew where the Japanese would strike. He knew when. What he did not know, what no one could know, was whether 3 battered American carriers and a scattering of marine aircraft at Midway could withstand the might of the Kido Butai. In the map room at Pearl, pencils traced arcs once more, this time around the atoll whose name would soon echo in history. The Admiral carried himself as he always had, calm, deliberate, no trace of haste in his voice. But his staff sensed the gravity. The Coral Sea had been rehearsal. Midway would be the test. Nimitz did not promise victory. He promised the chance for one. And that, in May 1942, was the most precious commodity the United States Navy possessed. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched in glassy indifference, a stage set for history. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had already been awake for hours, reading the first reports arriving via radio and secure channels. In the basement of Station HYPO, Joseph Rochefort's codebreakers sat bent over intercepts, relays flickering with raw intelligence. In the sync-pack plot room, grease pencil arcs converged on a tiny atoll midway between Asia and America. Nimitz had made his gamble. Now the dice rolled. The Japanese came first. At dawn, over 100 aircraft lifted from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, their engines echoing across the Pacific. Their target was Midway Atoll, its runways, its oil tanks, its fragile defences. The air raid was devastating but incomplete. Marine defenders fought back with outdated buffaloes and wildcats, their losses heavy but their resistance fierce. Bombs cratered runways, yet the island remained operational. Radio operators tapped frantically. AIR raid, many enemy planes. The warning was all Nimitz needed. The Admiral's plan depended on timing. He had placed faith in Rochefort's prediction of June 4th, faith in the repaired Yorktown, faith in Fletcher and Spruance to use surprise as a weapon. The Japanese believed the Americans broken after Coral Sea. Instead, 3 carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet, were lying in wait northeast of Midway, hidden by ocean and silence. Carrier war is a contest of scouting. That morning, both sides groped for each other across hundreds of miles of open sea. PBY Catalinas, sent out from Midway in wide arcs, searched the emptiness. At 5:34 a.m., one Catalina's message burned across the circuits. Many enemy planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. An hour later came the vital signal. 2 carriers and main body, 200 miles out. On the Japanese side, scout planes launched late, their coverage uneven. Chance and schedule betrayed them. For Yamamoto's fleet, the trap was still invisible. For Nimitz, the outline of his enemy was clear enough. He leaned over the Coral Sea chart, now repurposed for Midway, nodding once as reports confirmed Rochefort's prediction. The enemy had committed 4 carriers. Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, did not hesitate. At 7 a.m. he ordered his air groups to launch. SBD Dauntlesses, TBD Devastators, and F-4F Wildcats clawed into the morning sky, laden with bombs and torpedoes. Fletcher's Yorktown followed soon after. Across 3 decks, more than 150 American aircraft headed toward the Japanese carriers. They did not fly together. Navigators wrestled with bearings, some squadrons veering off course. The torpedo squadrons, slow and underprotected, pressed on with grim determination. VT-8 from Hornet, flying Devastators, was the first to find the enemy. Not one returned. They attacked bravely, torpedoes launched from suicidal ranges, but every plane was shot down. The same fate struck VT-6 from Enterprise and VT-3 from Yorktown, sacrificial charges that brought nothing in damage. Nothing except time. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were vulnerable in a way no staff officer could have scripted. Admiral Nagumo had been caught in indecision. His first strike against Midway had failed to knock out the island, and reports of American carriers arriving forced him to switch armament mid-cycle. His hangar decks were cluttered with fueled planes and stacked bombs. Into this chaos came the U.S. dive bombers. Enterprise's VB-6 and VS-6, guided by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's instinctive choice to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, arrived high above the enemy. Yorktown's VB-3 under Max Leslie approached moments later. From 19,000 feet, the Dauntlesses rolled into screaming dives. At 10:25 a.m., in the span of 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally hit. Bombs tore into hangar decks, igniting aviation fuel and ordnance. Explosions ripped carriers apart, flames consuming them from bow to stern. Pilots who had launched earlier returned to find their decks ablaze, their homes at sea gone. Only Hiryu remained, her decks intact, her air group still dangerous. Hiryu struck back with precision. Her dive bombers found Yorktown just after noon, scoring 3 hits. Fires raged, but damage control was swift. Within an hour, Yorktown seemed operational again. Japanese pilots, reporting her crippled, assumed they had sunk one carrier. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryu launched again, this time torpedo planes. They hit Yorktown twice, stopping her dead in the water. Fletcher, injured, passed tactical command to Spruance. But the price of Hiryu's defiance was her exposure. Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers located her later that afternoon. At 5 p.m., bombs struck home, igniting her flight deck. By nightfall, Hiryu too was lost. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz received reports piecemeal, each coded message adding a stroke to the picture. By June 5th, the truth was unmistakable. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed for the loss of 1 American, Yorktown. Japan's veteran air crews had been decimated. The Kido Butai, pride of the Imperial Navy, was broken. Nimitz's calculated gamble had paid off. He had trusted intelligence, trusted the miracle of Yorktown's repair, trusted commanders like Spruance to fight with nerve and restraint. Above all, he had used time bought by Rochefort's codebreakers, time stolen from Japanese timetables at Coral Sea, to force a battle on his terms. Midway did not end the Pacific War. That would require 3 more years of grinding campaigns. But it shifted the balance irrevocably. Japan had lost the strategic initiative. America, bloodied but unbroken, had seized it. When reporters asked Nimitz afterward what he thought of the victory, his answer was characteristically understated. It was our good fortune to be on the other side of the hill. His staff, however, knew the truth. The hill had been climbed by calculation, patience, and the nerve to risk everything when the moment came. The admiral who carried stillness like a uniform had wagered the future of the Pacific Fleet at Midway. And in 5 burning minutes, fate had sided with him. The cables reached Pearl Harbor in uneven bursts. Some were terse, enemy carriers heavily damaged, others more breathless, 3 carriers burning. By June 6th, the full picture hardened into fact. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. A 5th, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, lay at the bottom after American bombers caught her withdrawing. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had delivered not just a check, but a crushing blow. The price had been Yorktown, struck beyond saving on June 7th and scuttled by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine. Her loss hurt deeply, especially after the miracle of her rushed repair. More than 140 American aircraft had been lost, along with 307 sailors and aviators. Yet, when measured against Japan's 3,000 dead and the destruction of irreplaceable carrier air groups, the balance was unmistakable. Nimitz read the casualty reports in silence, pencil tapping the edge of the grey book. He understood what his men had bought: time. Midway had reset the clock. Japan's strategic momentum, the rolling thunder of expansion from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, was broken. Now the initiative belonged to the United States. In staff conferences, Nimitz made a point of crediting Station HYPO. Rochefort's cryptanalysts had turned scraps of intercepted code into the decisive edge. Without their work, Midway would have been another ambush in the dark. Instead, it became a deliberate trap. Nimitz's faith in intelligence had been vindicated, and his officers absorbed the lesson. Wars were won not just by gunnery and seamanship, but by silence, patience, and the ability to read the enemy's mind. Across the Pacific, the shock was just as deep. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 of its 6 first-line carriers, ships that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. More devastating than steel was the loss of pilots and deck crews. Japan's training pipeline could not replace them quickly. The United States, with its sprawling flight schools and factories, could. Admiral Yamamoto, once confident of dictating terms, now found himself reacting. The dream of forcing a negotiated peace with America dissolved in the smoke off Midway. For Nimitz, victory carried no triumphalism. In his post-battle report, he was spare and clinical, noting the gallant spirit of aviators and the fortuitous timing of attacks. To his staff, he admitted the truth. Chance had played its role. Had McCluskey not followed a lone destroyer, had Japanese scouts launched earlier, had Yorktown's damage control been less effective, the outcome could have tilted the other way. "We were fortunate," he told them, "but fortune comes to those who prepare." His preparation had been measured in decisions: to trust codebreakers, to rush Yorktown, to risk 3 carriers against 4. Each choice had carried the weight of potential ruin. Each had aligned at the moment of decision toward victory. Midway was not the end, it was the hinge. Nimitz knew the war would stretch years and consume oceans of fuel, mountains of steel, and thousands of lives. Ahead lay Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. The Japanese fleet was wounded but not destroyed. Its submarines still prowled, its armies still entrenched across half of Asia. Yet the balance had shifted. The initiative was American now, and with it came the freedom to choose when and where to strike. In the quiet after the battle, Nimitz walked the plot room at Pearl, the Coral Sea map now replaced by one centered on Midway. The grease pencil arcs were gone, wiped clean, leaving only the bare outline of the atoll. He paused, hands clasped behind his back, and said softly to an aide, "From here, we move west." Years later, veterans of his staff would remember not the thunder of reports or the cheers when news of Japanese losses was confirmed, but the calm presence of their admiral. In victory as in crisis, Chester W. Nimitz embodied stillness, the discipline to weigh chance against necessity, the courage to risk when the hour demanded, the humility to credit others when the battle was won. At Coral Sea he had bought survival. At Midway he had bought opportunity. And with that opportunity, America began the long march across the Pacific. The map room lights dimmed. The war went on. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Pacific belonged not to fate nor to fear, but to a commander who believed that preparation, patience, and courage could bend history.